So nice to see everyone on kind of a drizzly evening, but we're moving towards spring, so it's okay. I am very, very happy to welcome you to the 18th Annual Jewish-Christian Engagement Lecture at Fairfield University. I am Nancy Dalla Valle, the director of the Center for Catholic Studies. I've taken over this position from Paul Lakeland, who recently retired, and I know that some of you will recall that Paul, in fact, was usually the companion with the Bennett Center for this lecture, and now it's me. Happy to be doing it. I'm thrilled to continue this annual collaboration as two great religious traditions join to listen carefully to one another in a world that is again facing conflict and deeply charged questions. It is good that we stay at the table and continue the conversation. And I am honored to continue this collaboration with Dr. Glenn Diner, the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of the Bennett Center, who joined Fairfield in September 2022. Dr. Diner received the BA and PhD from Brandeis University. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2019 and serves as the co-editor of Shofar, a journal of interdisciplinary Jewish studies, as well as serving on the editorial boards of Poland and East European Jewish Affairs. Dr. Diner has authored numerous journal articles, essays, and books, most recently having a launch in Stanford for his latest book, The Light of Learning, Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust. For the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, I welcome Professor Diner.
Thanks so much for coming out. It's really scary out there. I should just mention, first of all, the number 18 is significant in Jewish culture. It's the numerical equivalent of chai, which means life. And so anytime you are trying to figure out like how much money to give somebody as a gift for their bar bat mitzvah, you do whatever it is, denominations of multiples of 18, and be 36, 72. These days we're getting into the hundreds, so it's but that's I think that means something. Now this is my second year. Last year we switch off with this collaboration. Last year was Paul Lakeland's choice of speaker. Is wonderful. This year was my choice. It's my first opportunity to choose somebody for this very exciting talk. And I don't know if you knew this, the very first choice I have, the obvious choice, is Annette Yoshiko Reed. Now, my reason for this is because we tend to think of early Christianity and Judaism as drastically parting ways. And there are these rigid binaries that were the norm for many, many, many years. And Annette, or Professor Reed, comes along, and I think we could kind of characterize her scholarship as breaking down those barriers, as complicating them, as showing their connections, really important connections, shared texts, influences, even sort of societal tolerance where you wouldn't expect to have it. We're accustomed to thinking of early church fathers as being very, very anti-Jewish, and Dr. Reed comes along and shows that actually there are exceptions to this, and they're important church fathers who didn't have those anti-Jewish views, and so on and so forth. So I just want to say that this is actually what Jewish Catholic relations can be in scholarship. It's simply finding those moments of convergence and coexistence that are really transforming the way we think about early Christianity and Judaism. So just by way of formal introduction, Dr. Reed is Krister Stendahl Chair of Divinity and Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Harvard Divinity School. Her recent books include Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism and Christianity, and Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism, She's currently working on a book on the cultural power of forgetting, which is going to be somewhat the theme tonight, focusing on the Jewish reception of the Second Temple past. And the title of her talk this evening is Ancient Judaism Between Christian Memory and Jewish Forgetting. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Annette Yoshiko-Reed.
Thank you so much. It's quite an honor to be here. And thanks to both Glenn and Nancy and Maria. And I also want to say it is true. I agree that at a moment, historical and cultural moment like this, the opportunity to really take seriously and think about dialogue against difference makes it not just a kind of honor to be here, but something that I feel is very special. So is it possible to undo forgetting? Once something has been cast into oblivion, can it ever be returned into remembrance? In the mid-19th century, this possibility came starkly into view at Pompeii. This ancient Roman city, famed for its destruction in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, had fascinated Europeans since its unearthing in 1748. But it wasn't until the technological innovations of the 19th century that startlingly new perspectives were brought to bear on what locals had long called the city of the dead. Under archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, plaster was injected into spaces left by the decay of flesh in volcanic ash. Enabled, as a result, was a precise modeling of the bodies of some of whom had died in the eruption. News reports from the time marvel at the eerie precision with which this method preserved a mustache, hair, folds of a dress, sandals. To visit Pompeii, one visitor remarked, is to find oneself as if transported back, brought face to face with the everyday life of 18 centuries ago. A city that local travelers once visited as a reminder of mortality now became a global monument to the power of modern knowledge and technology to recover what had been forgotten about the long ago ancient past. The city of the dead became a city of history. This much heralded archaeological advancement occurred at the same time that was also quite foundational for the development of the academic field of Jewish studies. And the coincidence did not escape one of its most influential historians. Beginning in the 1850s, the German Jewish scholar Heinrich Graetz had taken on the task of writing a Jewish history of the Jewish people from its beginnings to his present. In the 11th volume, published in 1870, Graetz treats the 19th century, coming to his own time and including the very embrace of the writing of history by Jews like himself. Lest the reader worry that this is a seemingly new interest and might be modernizing or assimilatory, Graetz explains this is actually a return, and thus, in fact, akin to the archaeological recovery of a lost city like Pompeii. In fact, in his words, it's as if at Pompeii, entombed men were suddenly aroused from the sleep of centuries, enabled to catch their thoughts, could recall their condition when catastrophe befell them, could conjure up before their mind's eye the splendor of their greatness, and if they felt that same power stirring still within them. Consequently, if Europeans were so amazed at Pompeii, by his logic, they should marvel even more so at the modern revival of history writing amongst the Jews. For, as he goes on to explain, it's actually akin to a resurrection. In his words again, a nation did arise from the darkness of the tomb, the only example of such a case in the chronicles of the annals of man. This resuscitated people, the Jewish race, endeavored at its resurrection to collect its thoughts and memories and recall a vision of its glorious past. Today, to us, it may seem strange that Graetz would choose such a metaphor. Aren't the Jews the people of history par excellence? So why liken our Jewish embrace of history of all things to a return from the dead? At the time, however, the metaphor made sense. In the 19th century, it was surprisingly common to appeal to archaeology to describe Judaism. Concurrent with the post-Napoleonic intensification of European excavations in Europe, for instance, the German Protestant theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher likened Judaism to an undecaying mummy. And it's also in this context that German poet Heinrich Heine, a Jewish convert to Christianity, described his former people, the Jews, as a mummy nation, seemingly alive, but actually as if dead. In his words, a petrified piece of world history. And thus, when German Jewish theologian Abraham Geiger set out to write his book on Judaism and its history in the 1860s, he first felt the need to ask, is Judaism an ancient ruin that should be abandoned? At first sight, this question might seem to pertain to a perception of whether or not Jews were more or less modern than other Germans. The historian Graetz, however, points out the connection to much older Christian ideas about Judaism as a purportedly dead religion. Already in his 1846 essay, The Structure of Jewish History, Graetz lamented how the Christian conception of history fully denies to Judaism any history since the loss of its national independence, that is, to the Romans, an event which coincided with another of great importance to the Christian world, which he does not explain, but seems to be the life and death of Jesus. The same structure, in Graetz's view, was now being replicated in his own times, the 19th century, by the world histories of thinkers like Hegel. In their treatment of Jews and Judaism, they took up, in essence, he claimed, again in his words, thus a habit of lowering Judaism into the grave, of issuing Jewish history a death certificate. And this is why a 19th century Jew could not even write a history of his own people without first, in his words, having to vindicate the right of Jewish history. For even in the ostensibly secular and universal academic approaches to the historical past then taking form, he claims there's a Christian perspective in general and Christian supersessionism in particular. I've spent most of my career writing about the history of Jewish-Christian relations, but I came across Graetz's very striking and poignant metaphor of Pompeii during my research for what was supposed to be a different sort of project. I'm currently writing a book about forgetting, which focuses on the medieval and modern Jewish reception of the ancient Jewish past. In that book, I largely take my inspiration from what we've learned from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls about ancient Judaism, which in turn, I suggest, gives us a new sense of just how much had been lost to later Jewish tradition, and thus also an opportunity to step back now and ask how this was forgotten, by whom, to what religious and cultural effects. In that book, my aim is to make an intervention into the study of antiquity within the academic field of Jewish studies in particular. Within that field, so much has been written about Jewish memory, and very little has been said about Jewish forgetting. If anything, forgetting is simply dismissed as if a failure of remembrance. Accordingly, my experiment in that book is to explore forgetting in terms of a cultural creativity, and thus I map a range of more active features and factors of forgetting, such as liturgical, ritual, festal, and pedagogical acts of pruning, making the past partitioned into usable pasts, literary acts of overwriting and rewriting, figures, texts, and events, archival acts of collecting and collectivizing selectively pieces of the past, and historiographical acts of collapsing, compressing, periodizing parts of the past into stories and narratives. My focus in that book, in other words, is on inner Jewish tradition and transmission. But part of what in the process has taken me by surprise is the difficulty of telling this story, pursuing this task, without also talking about Christianity and about the long shadow cast by Christian supersessionism more particularly. In my time with you here tonight, I'd thus like to step back and think a bit about why this is the case, in the spirit of this annual lecture on Jewish and Christian engagement, of which I'm so honored to have been invited to be a part. And to do so, I'll pull a bit from my book project, but I'd mostly like to experiment with following Graetz's insight forward and back, reflecting on supersessionism and its many cultural effects, including as an engine of forgetting and the forgetting of forgetting, but also, I'll suggest, sometimes an engine of the reversal of forgetting as well, especially of Jewish history. Much, of course, has been written about supersessionism, not least because it looms so large as an enduring challenge for Jewish-Christian relations to this day. After all, what's usually meant by supersessionism are those Christian doctrines and claims that the church has replaced Israel and the Jews as the chosen people of God, and that Christians have thus displaced Jews as the true heirs to God's promises in the Jewish scriptures, the readers to whom those Jewish scriptures belong as Old Testament, as well as the focal point of salvation history, and in fact, the very reason for God's engagement in the history of the world. Accordingly, the topic has been usually approached from a Christian perspective, focusing on theological or exegetical logics, ethical ramifications, questions about Christian identity, and Christian attitudes about Jews and Judaism. What I find so poignant and intriguing about Graetz, however, is his insistence that a Jewish perspective matters no less. Precisely because of the influence of Christian supersessionism on the West, including Western academia, its structure can sometimes feel so natural that it seems invisible. Far too often, for instance, even the most well-meaning discussions of Jewish-Christian dialogue tend to cast Jews and Judaism as passive subjects of misunderstanding or understanding by Christians. And far too often, even academic studies of Jewish-Christian relations tend to tell a Christian story from Christian sources, understood in Christian terms with Christian categories. Graetz reminds us that what is forgotten in the process is both the existence and the importance of Jewish perspectives as well. In what follows, I'd like to suggest that attention to these Jewish perspectives can help us to look beyond and behind the Christian assumptions well known to be embedded within modern ideas about religion. And among the results I'd like to suggest are new purviews onto the very origins of supersessionism. Today, for instance, it's conventional to describe Judaism, Christianity, and religion with spatial metaphors, and part of the effect has been to cast supersessionism as if akin to a property dispute or the contestation of land between two otherwise distinct nations or states. Graetz, however, draws our attention to the power of such claims for structuring the experience and telling of time, with effects on who is remembered, who is forgotten, who is treated as living in the present, and who, even if we're no less alive in the same present, can be treated as if essentially dead, or at least irrelevant to history and world history, and thus the world and its future. To follow Graetz's lead and suggestion, thus, is to be challenged to reread what's commonly treated as a theological idea, also as a temporal regime, a claim about time, a claim about history, and a claim that has identity-producing power, but also amnesia-inducing results. Graetz, as we have seen, focuses on what's forgotten about Jews. In my time here today, I'd like to make a case that what's forgotten is about Jews, but also about the intertwined history of Jews and Christians. Those vital connections and moments of connections between Jews and Christians, which continued well beyond the era of Christian origins, shaping, in fact, even the articulation of supersessionism as well as its effects, but occluded and hidden as a result of its very impact on the mutual forgetting of our shared past. Today, it's widely assumed, as Eliezer Berkovitz once noted, that Judaism is Judaism because it rejects Christianity, and Christianity is Christianity because it rejects Judaism. To be Jewish means not to be a Christian, and quite symmetrically, to be Christian now means not to be a Jew, and those who suggest otherwise often cause quite some discomfort as a result. In other words, Jewish and Christian identities are defined in terms of what we in the modern world commonly define and mark off as religions, a category presumed to denote separate, self-contained, symmetrical entities that by definition do not or should not overlap. Of course, though, in the case of Judaism and Christianity, we also all know there's an overlap. Jesus and his first followers were all Jews, and the Christian Bible includes all the books of the Jewish scriptures, all the Tanakh. One way to resolve this overlap is to project it back onto a single moment of origins, for instance, that's assumed to be somewhat temporary, soon giving way to the purported inevitability we now know today. And this is the approach we find within most academic scholarship on the history of Jewish-Christian relations. It's perhaps as a result, in fact, that research on early Jewish-Christian relations has somewhat ironically been focused much less on relations between Christians and Jews, and more on endless debates about the precise moment when Christianity writ large purportedly parted from Judaism writ large. Central to these debates has been the effort to find ancient precedents for our modern concepts of Judaism and Christianity as religions. Much attention thus has been paid to the first known attestations of the Greek word Christianismos, which is imagined to mark a milestone in the emergence of our current concept of Christianity, if not religion. The word Christianismos is first found in the 2nd century writings of the early church father Ignatius of Antioch, alongside Judaismos, the Greek term from which our English Judaism also ultimately derives. At first sight, then, we might seem to find what modern concepts take for granted, a symmetrical contrast between Christianismos and Judaismos, which might remind us of our modern ideas of Christianity and Judaism in conflict. When we look beyond the words to how Ignatius uses them, however, we notice that they don't quite function like the names of two religions. In fact, for Ignatius, the very point is that Judaismos depends on or puts trust in Christianismos. The two, in other words, are inextricably linked, like past and present, prophecy and fulfillment. Far from separate or simultaneously, as we often think religions should be, the two are consecutive and connected, two links in the same timeline. The problem for Ignatius, thus, are those who don't realize that past is past, and not just past, but quickly decomposing. Even in the earliest known pairings of Christianismos and Judaismos, we thus see the beginnings of a structural erasure that Graetz would later notice and bemoan. Judaism is cast as prehistory and prologue to Christianity. And accordingly, Ignatius takes aim at Judaizing Christians, who he likens to tombs and gravestones, those who try to live in a buried past, even in the midst of an emergent messianic present. So too for Tertullian, who's the first known author to use the Latin cognates to Judaismos and Christianismos. In the 3rd century, when Tertullian says of a man that he tried to set up a great and total distinction between Judaism and Christianity, he doesn't mean it positively. The man in question is the arch-heretic Marcion, and Tertullian is describing him in these terms so as to cast his distinction as strange, just as bizarre as trying to bifurcate justice from goodness. Here, too, Judaism and Christianity are asserted to be essentially inseparable. Yet Tertullian's concern has nothing to do with how Christians of his time should treat Jews of his time. What's at stake for him, rather, is the structuring of time. Marcion had asserted a temporality of radical newness, whereby he claimed Jesus came as the son and emissary of an unknown God, not connected at all to Israel and its Messiah. Against Marcion, Tertullian claims a much longer history, which begins with Jewish history as recorded in Jewish scriptures that he and other Christians read as predicting Jesus as Jewish Messiah or Christos. This claim and the concern to counter Marcion is also central to the text that scholars typically credit with inaugurating Christian supersessionism, that is, Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. It's here, for instance, we find the first explicit claims that the church is the true Israel, that Jewish scriptures belong to Christians. Justin's dialogue is commonly treated as a key work for the articulation of Christianity as distinct from Judaism. None other than Daniel Boyarin, for instance, once titled an article, Justin Martyr Invents Judaism. This captures much of how Justin is read. But it also points to what we miss when we read Justin's dialogue through the lens of modern categories of religion. Justin himself actually never uses the term Judaismos, nor does he use the term Christianismos. To be sure, his imagined interlocutor, the other side of the dialogue, is a Jew, Trypho, and Justin refers to your genos when addressing him. And thus, often scholars sometimes assume that every you in the text means Judaism or the Jews, every us means Christianity. When we look closer, we see that this too does not fit the categories used in the text itself. Not only does Justin in the dialogue refer to the genos of the Jews as cut into two by the coming of the Messiah Jesus, but he refers to his own genos as that of the Sumerians, which is similarly cut in two, as are the nations more broadly. What does the cutting here is, again, time, which has been decisively split with the coming of the Messiah, and thus peoplehood, too, each bifurcated between those who see an epochal shift in time and those who do not yet. Even Justin's supersessionism, however, is not as simple as it seems at first sight. The dialogue is often read and becomes influential in relation to a debate against Jews and Judaism, but its actual aim is to argue for the superiority of Jewish prophecy over Greek philosophy. At the beginning of the dialogue, for instance, Justin explains he himself learned this truth through a love of prophecy ignited within him like a flame, and which he claims enabled him to interpret the writings of prophets like Isaiah. It's in these writings, Justin goes on to claim, that he found the truth that makes him a true philosopher. What he also found predicted, he claims, was the forgetting of this very truth by the Jewish teachers of his own time. And here we get to the question of supersessionism. Just as Greek philosophers have no claim to the truth, according to Justin, so he claims that Jewish teachers can no longer understand their own scriptures, which have become to them like a sealed book or like sight to the blind. And thus, when Trypho disagrees with him, Justin can quite conveniently depict the misunderstanding as proving his very point. Justin's appeal to Jewish blindness resonates with anti-Pharisaic polemics, such as in the Gospel of Matthew, as well as later Christian anti-Judaism. Notably, however, it also betrays Justin's very deep debts to Jews and Judaism. His theory of exegesis is a theory of forgetting, and this theory of forgetting is based on Isaiah 29, which Justin quotes repeatedly in its Greek version. What he claims to see fulfilled in his own time, thus, is Isaiah's prediction that God will remove the wisdom from the wise. This theory of Jewish forgetting would eventually become a cornerstone of Christian anti-Judaism. But what has not been noticed, at least to my knowledge, is that it's also an extension of an ancient Jewish discourse, richly attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular. Already in the 2nd century BCE, for instance, the animal apocalypse and apocalypse of weeks retell and predict the whole of Jewish history with appeal to a time of divinely sent blindness upon all of Israel, which will be followed by a new awakening of only some back to understanding. So too, within the Damascus document, a sectarian Jewish identity is here expressed with reference to predictions that Israel will forget, whereby it's God that does this. He makes all Israel unable to see the truth, in order that later he may correct this with the awakening of some. Each, in turn, of these texts see this prediction as speaking to their own time, and each see themselves as the few to whom the awakening or understanding refers, and each claims that God has caused the rest of Israel to forget. From the surviving fragments of 4Q Pesher Isaiah C, it's clear that some in the Qumran community read themselves into Isaiah 29 in particular. 4Q 163, for instance, preserves a lengthy quotation, which is set off as a lemma, including the very verses most often quoted by Justin, verses 10 to 11. Unfortunately, however, the text is fragmentary, as so much of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the interpretation part hasn't been preserved. But we do know, or can suspect, that some Jewish exegetes were similarly appealing to these verses of Isaiah 29 to talk about forgetting. After all, in no less than the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat 138b, we find the same verses adduced precisely in relation to Israel forgetting Torah. Justin, Martyr, is usually read through the lens of later Christian ideas about Judaism, as well as concepts of supersessionism and modern concepts of religion. What's missed in the process, however, is that even his supposed invention of Christian supersessionism is deeply rooted in an elevation of the writings of ancient Jewish prophets as unique sources of the truth, categorically superior to Greek philosophy, and a theory of Jewish forgetting that's based in Isaiah 29 with parallels in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Talmud. Upon closer analysis, moreover, Justin's point is actually not so far from what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He actually never denounces Judaism, and he never claims that all Jews are fated to be forever blind. As in Isaiah 29, the problems with the teachers, the wise from whom wisdom has been removed. As in the Damascus document, the solution is that God will send new teachers. His claim is that Jews should listen to prophetic exegetes like himself. And just as in the animal apocalypse, it's presumed that some among Israel are now opening their eyes, while some are not and remain blind. Far from separating Judaism from Christianity, Justin asserts that the Jewish genos, like every other genos upon the earth, is cut in two by the coming of the Jewish Messiah, severed along the lines between sight and blindness, memory and forgetting. As a result of Justin's influence, what came to be forgotten among many non-Jewish, that is, Gentile Christians, was the very Jewishness of the Jewish scriptures, which were reread thus as belonging only to Gentile Christians. Already in late antiquity, Christian reading practices came to naturalize these erasures, and with them the idea that the pre-Christian Jewish past wasn't really Jewish at all, but already a Christian past. And thus Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, could assure his readers that Abraham was a Christian in all but name, all the while adducing Jewish writings from Genesis to Philo to Josephus to make this point. Unless we be tempted to dismiss this forgetting of actual living Jews in the present as accidental, it bears reminding that both Justin and Eusebius had close connections to the land of Israel. The former was from Samaria, as we saw, and the latter wrote in Caesarea. Even into the 4th century, however, other Christians were taking different approaches, and some even used different theories about time and forgetting to do so. Most explicit in this regard is the pseudo-Clementine homilies. The homilies claim to be a first-hand account of the Apostle Peter's teachings as heard and recorded by Clement of Rome. And the text is prefaced by an epistle that claims to be from the Apostle Peter himself to James, bemoaning the misrepresentation of Peter's teachings as antinomian, and thus calling for his writings to be circulated only to the circumcised. The pseudo-Clementine homilies claim to preserve these true teachings of Peter, which include the most thoroughgoing early example of inner Christian resistance to supersessionism. The Apostle Peter is here used to stress there are actually two paths to salvation. Jesus has opened up a path for salvation to the Gentiles, but Jews can still be saved through the teachings of Moses with no need for Jesus at all. Or in other words, Jewish time continues, unchanged by the birth and death of Jesus and shaped by the revelations at Sinai. Israel has not been supplanted, it's been supplemented. And if anything, Pharisees and other Jews thus here provide a model, according to the homilies, for Gentile Christians to embrace monotheism and, more importantly, to reject polytheism, to reject Greek paideia, to reject Hellenism. If Peter really said all this, however, how did it come to be forgotten? The pseudo-Clementine homilies explains this too, outlining an explicit theory of forgetting that parallels but answers that of Justin Martyr, and to opposite effect. Here, what's claimed is that the relationship between Moses following Jews and Jesus following Gentiles is constituted by a mutual forgetting of everything they actually share. Their blindness is symmetrical, and it's because God chose to hide each from the other. In effect, then, the 4th century authors and redactors of the pseudo-Clementines used the Apostle Peter to speak to the commonalities of Jews and Christians, speaking as if a reminder from the 1st century past. As a reminder, it seems to respond specifically to the allure of Hellenism and Greek education for many late antique Christians. Yet at the same time, the pseudo-Clementines also seem to be aware they're speaking this reminder at a moment where the commonalities between Jews and Christians were quickly becoming forgotten. We may glimpse thus some reaction to the anti-Judaism coming to define the dominant Christian images of Jews and Judaism at the dawn of the Christianization of the Roman Empire. But we may also, interestingly enough, glimpse some glint of awareness of their Jewish counterparts as well. If the only texts that we had from late antiquity were Jewish sources, we would actually have no idea that Christians even existed. In Christian sources from the 2nd to 4th centuries, this time from Ignatius to Justin to Eusebius, we hear a constant chatter of anxiously repeated repudiations of Jews and Judaism. By contrast, however, we search in vain for contemporaneous Jewish references to Christians and Christianity from these same early centuries. The seeming silence has long puzzled scholars, and honestly, most simply resolve it by using Christian sources, like Justin's dialogue with Trypho, to reconstruct the other side of what's simply presumed to be a symmetrical conversation. Here too, however, we may gain some fresh perspective when we set aside the expectation of finding Judaism and Christianity interacting as separate and symmetrical in our modern senses of a term religion. Or, put differently, we may do well to follow Graetz's reminder of how academic approaches too often take Christian categories for granted, even when studying Jewish sources. This is especially important for understanding Jewish sources from the 2nd to 4th centuries of the Common Era, which are concurrent to the rise of Christianity, but also innovative in their own right, speaking to the rise of the Rabbinic movement after the destruction of the Second Temple and the failure of 2 Jewish revolts against the Romans. The oldest literary remains of the early Rabbinic movement include the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Halachic Midrashim, and these Jewish sources explain identity and difference in their own terms, with their own totalizing taxonomic systems, possibly reciprocal, but certainly not symmetrical or reducible to their Christian counterparts. Scholars, for instance, often note early Rabbinic literature does not have a word for Christianity, but as Susanna Heschel and Daniel Boyarin remind us, they also don't include a word for Judaism. Instead, late antique rabbis extend a biblical pattern of partitioning humankind into a binary divide of Israel and the nations, Jew and Goy. And if anything, as Ishai Rosenzweig has shown, early rabbinic literature further reifies this very difference. The bifurcation, Israel and the nations, clearly did not originate as a reaction to the rise of Christianity. Nevertheless, it's intriguing that among its results is to deny the most distinctive claim of Christians, that is, the claim of the inclusion of Gentiles alongside Jews as those who shall inherit God's promises to Abraham. From the perspective of rabbinic systems of classification, nothing changed before and after Jesus. Jews remain Jews, whether or not they believe in Jesus as the Messiah or Bar Kokhba or no one or someone else. And more importantly, perhaps, Gentiles remain Gentiles. And here too, whether or not they believe in Jesus, whether or not they read the Jewish scriptures. What we find here, in other words, is precisely the opposite of Justin's claim that the coming of Jesus cut the Jewish genos into 2. In the Mishnah, all Israel remains all Israel. Jewish peoplehood remains uncleaved by messianic claims and claimants, and so too Jewish history. Again, it's highly unlikely these moves developed merely or even mainly in reaction to Christianity. And indeed, the idea of all Israel in the Mishnah are probably more likely shaped by the ideas that we saw in texts like the Damascus document, an inner Jewish concern. Nevertheless, it still remains striking that rabbinic categories of identity and difference result in a categorical subversion of a distinctly Christian claim about time. And it's thus intriguing to note their effects and their intensification, particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the very centuries that begin to see an influx of Gentile Christian pilgrims, monks, and scholars coming to the land of Israel from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, as well as building churches and monasteries, remapping Roman Palestine into Christian Holy Land. When Christians from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, after all, began to settle or visit the land of Israel, they did so precisely due to a contention of a connection with this land as part of their own past, even if they had never been there, as a land that felt the footsteps of Jesus. What these Christians claimed, in effect, is precisely what the rabbinic categories deny in their insistence on the irreducible difference between Jews and all different sorts of non-Jews. What's relegated to forgetting in the process is that the Gentile Christian church has any connection to Jewishness at all. And accordingly, even if rabbinic classifications were not invented to respond to Christians or to this new situation in late antiquity, there's perhaps a bit of resistance to be glimpsed in the very choice of late antique rabbis living in the land of Israel to maintain these categories even when the landscape was transforming around them, with local Jewish life in the land of Israel now within a newly rebuilt, remapped image of imperial Christianity. This dynamic, again, can't be reduced simply to a symmetrical Jewish counterpart or response to the late antique Christian forgetting surrounding living Jews and the Jewish present. But it did, however, have a reciprocal effect, inasmuch as it contributed to the blurring of any memory of the connection between them. What had been a shared past, shared land, and intertwined history increasingly didn't seem shared or intertwined at all, as indeed the authors of the pseudo-Clementines already seemed to notice in the 4th century. What is symmetrical, however, is another forgetting. Christians like Ignatius, Justin, and Eusebius erased the Jewish present in the process of claiming the Jewish past for Christians. Within Rabbinic Judaism, however, we see the vitality of the Jewish present, but also a radical narrowing in the memory and transmission of the Jewish past. Late antique rabbis study and interpret, of course, the Torah and other Jewish scriptures. But as scholars have long noted, the rabbinic forgetting encompassed much of the history and literature of what we now call the Second Temple period. That is the period between the Babylonian exile and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, almost all of the rich variety of non-biblical, pre-rabbinic Jewish writing seems to have been abandoned within Rabbinic Judaism, including what we now know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also the writings of Philo, Josephus, and other Greek Jewish literature, and almost all of what we now call Old Testament Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. This is the phenomenon I'm exploring in some detail within my book about forgetting, but for our purposes here tonight, what's important to note are the effects. With the rabbinic abandonment of much of the literary history and heritage of Second Temple Judaism, what was also lost to the Jewish tradition was the context that makes Jesus and Christianity even make sense as part of Judaism. What became faded as a result was precisely the memory that there was a shared past and could be an intertwined history. Just as Christians like Justin and Eusebius were reducing Judaism to the pre-Christian past, so their rabbinic Jewish contemporaries were abandoning much of that same past. We've noted already how the late antique Christian forgetting of Christianity's Jewishness, as if through supersessionism, was an internal forgetting of sorts, as well as an external forgetting. But so too, I'd suggest, with the late antique Jewish forgetting of the Second Temple past that connects Judaism to Jesus and Christianity. Among the results of this forgetting was also the forgetting of their intertwined histories and the invisibility of each of parts of their own past. Christians, in a sense, note this explicitly. If early Christians like Ignatius and Justin set the stage for reducing Judaism to the Christian past, they also set a stage for a perennial turn of Christians to pre-Christian Jewish sources. It's perhaps not coincidental, thus, that so many Jewish sources from the Second Temple period came to be preserved solely by Christians. Most famous in this regard are the Greek writings of Josephus and Philo, together with the Septuagint and the Epistle of Aristeas. To this, we might add those pre-Christian Jewish scriptures variously preserved in the Old Testaments of different churches, which encompass what Protestants now call the Old Testament Apocrypha, which includes Second Temple texts like Tobit, Judith, 1 and 2 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, but also some of what scholars now call Old Testament pseudepigrapha, which include pre-Christian Jewish books like 1 Enoch and Jubilees that circulated in Ethiopic, Greek, and other translations, and much else besides. Eusebius, for instance, knew and quoted from a number of other Greek Jewish authors from the Second Temple period, including Demetrius, Artapanus, and Eupolemus. To this day, we almost wholly owe the preservation of all these ancient Jewish texts and traditions to Christian authors, Christian scribes, Christian translators. There's a certain irony in this. Supersessionism, as a temporal regime, functioned as an engine of the Christian forgetting of post-Christian Judaism. But it also spurred the later Christian impulse to collect, preserve, translate what came before, resulting in an exceptionally comprehensive remembrance of pre-Christian Judaism among Christians. The irony is compounded by the unexpected effects upon Jewish history and Judaism as well. Beginning in the Middle Ages, we find a number of really striking moments when learned Jews came to realize that Christians still preserved ancient Jewish texts and traditions lost to Jewish tradition. In fact, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scroll is actually an exception to the much broader pattern whereby throughout history, Jews have long re-encountered lost or forgotten Jewish texts, primarily due to their contacts with Christians. This is how Nachmanides learned of Judith and the Wisdom of Solomon, for instance, and how Josephus was selectively recovered as Iosipon, and how Arzaria de Rossi rediscovered the Jewishness of Philo and learned about the Epistle of Aristeas and worked on the Septuagint. Among the indirect and epiphenomenal effects of supersessionism as a temporal regime was ironically to preserve the Second Temple Jewish past and thus to enable the reversal of an inner Jewish forgetting of this very past. This brings us back to where we began. We noted at the outset how Heinrich Graetz, writing in the 19th century, framed the entire enterprise of modern Jewish history writing as a resurrection. To the degree to which Jewish history returning to life was a reversal of Jewish forgetting, in his view, the victory he proclaims for Jewish remembrance is against a Christian erasure of post-Christian Judaism. At the time when Graetz was writing, the secularized Christian narrative was already having institutional effects on the very shaping of what we now think of as academic disciplines. Seth Schwartz, for instance, has noted how the humanistic organization of disciplines in the 18th and 19th centuries separated classics from theology, and since the history and literature of Jews in the pre-Christian period were included in the latter, post-70 Jews became ignored, both by classicists and by theologians, for whom the Jews had ceased to matter after Jesus. Or, as Graetz already put in the 19th century, Christianity swallows up the whole of ancient history. Just as Graetz's metaphor of resurrection is thus well chosen, so too his choice to speak about Pompeii, a city destroyed in 79 CE, that is in the very same decade as the failure of the first Jewish revolt against Rome and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. When Graetz invokes the dormancy from which he sees Judaism and Jewish history awakening in the 19th century, it's with this contention that there was a shift started at the end of the first century that continued to define Jewish life for almost 2 millennia thereafter. When Graetz evokes Jewish history as now awakening, in other words, it's with the assumption of a change that started at 70, turning like a pivot with the destruction of the temple, the rise of the rabbis, the Jewish abandonment of historical writings like 1 and 2 Maccabees and Josephus, and with them, the abandonment of the very project of history. In that very process, however, Graetz reveals how even his resistance to Christianity is rooted in a shared past and intertwined histories of Jews and Christians. For early rabbis and their heirs, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 essentially marks the moment when Judaism could become rabbinic. Yet the date is also important for Justin Martyr and his heirs, who claim that the fall of the Second Temple to the Romans attested the transfer of chosenness from Israel to the church. And this contention became enshrined within Christian historiography as well, particularly after the 4th century. To do so, Eusebius, for instance, famously appropriates the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, and yet another example of how even Christian anti-Judaism betrays Christianity's close links with Judaism. But interestingly, we find a striking parallel later in Graetz, too, in the 19th century. He speaks quite triumphantly of the Jewish recovery of Jewish history. What he doesn't mention is how this recovery was possible. And it's by virtue of the very preservation of the writings of Josephus by Christians. In his own histories, in fact, Graetz's incursion into the Christian archive of preserved Jewish writings doesn't even stop there. He cites Josephus, uses 1 and 2 Maccabees, but he also reclaims New Testament Gospels like Matthew and their accounts of Jesus, and he even quotes and reclaims the pseudo-Clementines and their accounts of Peter to argue that the earliest Jewish apostles were part of Judaism, no less than Christianity. Revived in the process is the fullness of a Jewish history, resurrected from the cuts of Christian supersessionism, but also revived from the inner Jewish forgettings of the Second Temple Jewish past from within Rabbinic Judaism and the Jewish tradition. Remembered, perhaps in the process, are the intertwinings of Judaism and Christianity that continued long past any moment of Christian origins, evident no less in Ignatius and Justin Martyr than in the writings of Heinrich Graetz. Thank you.